This $1 piece of trash? Finally, it's yours, my mother hissed, handing my brother a ticket to heaven while handing me a pile of rubbish. She thought she'd finally gotten rid of me. Little did she know that this piece of trash was actually a lost Vermeer painting worth $500 million. Now, I didn't need an apology. I wanted her entire empire. Her wicked smile still haunted my mind like acid as I escaped the storm and entered the monster's lair. The rain in Boston doesn't just fall. It seeps into the marrow of the city, cold and unrelenting. I stood in the heavy shadows of the Crawford Library, the scent of expensive floor wax and old money thickening the air until it felt like a physical weight. Crystal chandeliers flickered overhead, and casting jagged diamonds of light across mahogany walls lined with books no one in this family ever bothered to read. I wasn't a guest at this gala. I was a ghost, an invisible fixture leaning against the buffet table, watching the performance of a lifetime. My mother, Griselda, stood at the center of the room, her silk-gloved hand resting on the shoulder of my brother, Dante. She looked every bit the Beacon Hill matriarch, her smile as polished as the silverware. She gestured toward a mahogany box on the table. With a flourish that demanded the room's undivided attention, she pulled out a first-class ticket to Hawaii. The crowd, a sea of silk and tailored wool, erupted into sycophantic applause. Dante beamed, his chest puffing out with an arrogance that made my stomach churn. Griselda's voice carried over the din, sharp and melodic. "Yea, the future of the Crawford legacy deserves the horizon," she declared. Dante took the ticket as if it were his birthright, a golden anchor for the golden sun. I remained in the corner, my fingers tracing the edge of a linen napkin. I wondered if anyone else saw the cracks behind her foundation. Griselda turned her gaze toward me, and the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a thin, predatory curve of the lips. She reached behind the bar and pulled out a rectangular object wrapped in a torn, mud-stained garbage bag. The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a televised execution. "And for Midge," she said, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper that reached every ear in the room. "I found this at a roadside garage sale for $1. It's quiet, faded, and overlooked. And I thought it mirrored your place in this world perfectly." Laughter rippled through the library, polite but cruel. I walked forward, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood, and accepted the trash-wrapped canvas. It was heavy, heavier than I expected. My hands didn't shake. I looked at the mud on the plastic and then up at the woman who had spent 32 years trying to make me feel small. I didn't feel small. I felt a strange, cold clarity. A person's worth is never truly determined by the eyes of those who refuse to see them. I realized then that their blindness was my greatest advantage. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who claimed to love you, only to realize you were the only one there with a soul? Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to find your own light in a house full of shadows. Griselda wasn't finished, and she produced a fountain pen and a single sheet of paper, a gift acceptance acknowledgement. She insisted I sign it to prove I valued the family's effort. It was a classic Crawford move, a performance of generosity masking a legal trap. I took the paper, my eyes scanning the dense 8-point font at the bottom. Tucked between sentences about gratitude and family tradition was the poison. A clause stating that by accepting this asset, I waived all future rights to the Crawford family trust. I knew the truth Griselda was hiding. I'd seen the overdue notices in her desk. I knew the trust was a hollow shell, drained by her gambling and Dante's failed investments. She was trying to buy my silence and my legal exit for the price of $1. I looked at her, seeing the desperation beneath the Botox and the pearls. My heart didn't harden. It actually softened. She was so afraid of being found out that she was willing to discard her own daughter. I took the pen. I didn't hesitate. My signature was firm, a final stroke of a pen that felt more like a key turning in a lock. I am signing this because I want you to have the peace you are so desperately trying to buy, Mother, I said, my voice steady and clear. I don't need a name to know who I am. Griselda flinched, her eyes darting to the guests to see if they'd heard. She hadn't expected grace. She had expected a tantrum. Beside her, Dante sneered, reaching into his pocket and tossing 3 copper pennies at my feet. They hit the floor with a hollow metallic clatter. A tip for the help, he mocked. I didn't look down at the coins. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. And I simply tucked the garbage-wrapped painting under my arm and turned toward the door. The rain met me at the threshold of the mansion. I didn't call a cab. I needed the cold air to clear the scent of lavender and lies from my lungs. I walked toward the north end, my boots splashing through puddles, the weight of the canvas pressing against my ribs. Griselda thought she had won. She thought she had erased me from the family ledger for the cost of a cup of coffee. But as I walked, I thought about the way the light had hit the corner of that canvas through a tear in the plastic. There was a specific shade of blue, lapis lazuli, that hadn't been used in that way for centuries. Sometimes, to gain everything, you have to be willing to lose the things that were never truly yours. And I had lost a trust fund that didn't exist, and a family that didn't want me. In exchange, I had a signature that made me a free woman, and a piece of trash that felt like it was vibrating with a secret. They say that those who try to extinguish your flame only end up providing the darkness you need to truly shine. I was no longer a Crawford daughter. I was a woman with a plan. I reached my studio apartment, a small space that smelled of linseed oil and the peppermint tea I drank to stay awake. I set the canvas on my easel, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my chest. I didn't even take off my wet coat. I reached for the torn plastic and peeled it away, layer by agonizing layer. The frame was rotting, the wood swollen with moisture, but the paint beneath, the paint was alive. Under the dim glow of my desk lamp, I saw it. A girl sitting at a harpsichord, the light falling across her face with a soft mathematical precision. The way the shadows dissolved into the background wasn't just skill. It was a signature. It was a technique only one man in history had ever truly mastered. My breath hitched, the air catching in my throat as I stared at the junk my mother had used to humiliate me. It wasn't just a painting. It was a masterpiece that had been missing for 300 years. And I realized that the dollar Griselda spent to insult me was about to become the most expensive mistake she ever made. The silence of my studio was a living thing, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the window pane. I stood frozen before the easel, the air in my lungs suddenly too thin to support the weight of what I was seeing. And the girl at the harpsichord stared back at me, her gaze timeless, rendered in a light that seemed to emanate from the canvas itself rather than the flickering halogen lamp above. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a ghost returning from the grave. I carefully placed the frame under the harsh clinical glow of my restoration light, my fingers trembling as I reached for a fine, bristled brush. I worked with a surgeon's precision, clearing away decades of grime and that insulting $1 price sticker that Griselda had used as a weapon. Every stroke revealed more of the impossible, the deep, luminous ultramarine of the girl's dress, a pigment made from crushed lapis lazuli that only one man in the 17th century used with such reckless, beautiful abundance. A heavy knock at the door made me jump, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped space. I checked the peephole to see Xavier, drenched to the bone, his eyes wide with an urgency that matched the storm outside. I let him in, and the moment he saw the canvas, the frantic energy of the night came to a sudden, absolute halt. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, water dripping from his coat onto my hardwood floor, his breath hitching in his chest. Xavier was a man of science, a premier expert for Christie's who had seen the world's greatest treasures. But as he leaned over the painting, the color drained from his face. He began to murmur technical observations, the specific lead tin yellow in the highlights, the pointillist light effects that were the unmistakable fingerprints of John Vermeer. Midge. he whispered, his voice cracking with a reverence I had never heard before. This isn't just a masterpiece. This is the concert. It's been missing since the Gardner heist in 1990. It's the most sought-after stolen work in the world. We spent the next hour analyzing the craquelure, the intricate web of age cracks that acted as a biological map of the painting's life. I watched the light dance across the surface, marveling at how something so valuable could have survived in a damp garage, hidden under a garbage bag. It occurred to me that true value often survives by being overlooked, just as I had learned to grow strong in the shadows of my mother's neglect. The investigative rhythm intensified as I began to examine the structural integrity of the old wooden stretcher bars. Something felt wrong, a slight misalignment in the joinery of the frame that didn't match the craftsmanship of the period. I picked up a small dental pick, my heart hammering against my ribs, and carefully pried back a corner of the molding. A hidden compartment, narrow and shallow, revealed its secrets to the light of the 21st century. Inside lay a small, weathered piece of stationery, tucked away like a whispered secret. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my father's, firm, elegant, and filled with a warmth that Griselda could never extinguish. But it was what lay beneath the note on the interior wood that made my knees buckle. A thumbprint, rendered in a dried, dark brown stain that I knew with chilling certainty was blood. It was his signature of protection. He must have known, even years ago, that my mother's greed would eventually consume everything we owned. He had hidden this golden anchor specifically for me, a silent promise kept from across the divide of his illness. I clutched the frame, the rough wood biting into my palms, and felt a profound connection to the man who was currently a prisoner of his own body in a Beacon Hill hospital. He didn't leave this to me to make me rich, Xavier, I said, my voice thick with a sorrow that finally found its way out. He left it to make sure I could never be owned by anyone again. He knew they would try to erase me. My love for him flared into a protective fire, a fierce loyalty that had nothing to do with the $500 million this canvas represented. It was about the dignity he had preserved for me when the rest of the world saw only a discarded daughter. Xavier began to pace the small room, his mind already calculating the legal minefield we were standing in. Possessing a stolen Vermeer is a felony, Midge. We are talking about international law, federal agencies. If Griselda finds out you have this, she won't just take it. She'll destroy you to cover her own tracks. We discussed the deed of gift I had signed at the party. I realized that in her haste to strip me of my inheritance, my mother had inadvertently severed this painting from the Crawford estate. By making it a gift and forcing me to waive my rights to the trust, she had legally made the Vermeer my sole, private property. Xavier urged me to go to the authorities immediately, but I stopped him with a single look. I knew the Crawford family better than anyone. I knew the predatory interest rates Griselda was paying to sharks like Marcus, and I knew Dante's reckless desperation. If they realized what was in this room, they wouldn't hesitate to use my father's safety at the hospital as a bargaining chip to force my hand. I explained my plan to move the painting into a climate-controlled vault at Sotheby's under a newly formed anonymous LLC. We must be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, I told him. I wasn't seeking to harm my family, but I was done allowing them to harm me. I asked Xavier to help me find a way to use my own small savings, the money I had earned restoring gardens, to secretly upgrade my father's medical care. I wanted him moved to a private wing where Griselda's charity couldn't reach him. It was a small act of kindness in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. As we finished securing the Vermeer in a specialized transport case, my phone pings with a sharp, intrusive notification. It was a social media alert from Nylene. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach as I opened the app. She had posted a teaser video, the camera panning across a high-end designer showroom before cutting to a blurry, mocking photo of my apartment building. The caption read, "Cleaning out my trashy sister's apartment for charity. You won't believe what she keeps in the dark. Stay tuned for the live stream tomorrow." I stared at the locked studio door, then at the brightly lit phone screen. The dazzling light on my sister's dressing table was about to reveal a secret that could save me or bury me forever. The time for hiding was over, and the time for a silent, strategic battle had begun. The Crawford family legacy was built on lies, but the truth was finally beginning to emerge from beneath my father's deceptive facade. The blue light of my smartphone was the only thing illuminating my small studio, casting long, skeletal shadows against the walls. For 3 days, I had lived in a state of hypervigilance, my mind a battlefield of legal contingencies and protective instincts. I knew the Crawford machinery would eventually turn its gears toward me, but I didn't expect the first strike to be so public. The silence of the North End was suddenly shattered by the heavy thud of boots in the hallway and the shrill, performative laughter of my sister, Nylene. I didn't move from my chair as the door burst open. Nylene stood there, her arm outstretched like a weapon, the lens of her iPhone pointed directly at my face. She was already mid-sentence, broadcasting to her 500,000 followers with a smirk that was as sharp as a razor. "And here she is, guys," Nylene chirped, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern. "The sister who turned her back on her own family to live in this... Well, you can see for yourselves. We're here to save Midge from her own squalor." She panned the camera around my modest room, lingering on the worn fabric of my armchair and the landscape sketches on my desk. Heart icons and laughing emojis bubbled up on her screen in a frantic, digital tide. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate, holding a lukewarm cup of tea like a shield. I didn't scream, and I didn't try to block the lens. I remembered the words of an old mentor. Peace is an inside job, and if you don't give someone permission to humiliate you, their insults remain theirs alone. "Midge, honey, look at this place," Nylene continued, her eyes scanning for the Vermeer I had already moved to safety. "It's pathetic. It's depressing." She reached into a designer pouch at her waist and pulled out a handful of loose change. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the coins at my feet. They hit the hardwood with a series of sharp metallic pings, rolling into the shadows. "There, a little charity fund for my useless sister." I looked at the pennies on the floor, then back at her. "I hope this performance brings you the validation you're so clearly lacking, Nylene," I said softly. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but the digital audience was already baying for more. The video went viral within the hour, a digital crucifixion choreographed by my own blood. My phone began to vibrate incessantly, notifications, insults, and then the call I had been bracing for. Griselda didn't bother with a greeting. Her voice was cold, transactional. "The family reputation is in tatters because of your stubbornness, Midge," she hissed. "I've arranged for a car to take you to the estate in Maine. You'll disappear for a few months until this blows over. But before you go, you'll return all household items you took from the library, specifically that painting." I hit the record button on my laptop, the small red light a witness to the extortion. "That painting was a legal deed of gift, Mother," I replied, my voice a calm contrast to her vitriol. Under Massachusetts law, this level of harassment constitutes intentional infliction of emotional distress. The painting is no longer part of the Crawford estate. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end. I realized then that she wasn't motivated by shame, but by the sheer, desperate panic of a woman whose financial house of cards was finally catching fire. Those who try to bury you often forget that you are a seed. Despite the bile rising in my throat, I ended the call and dialed the hospital. I spoke to my father's nurse, her voice a warm comfort in the cold night. I ensured he was sleeping, protected from the media storm Nylene had unleashed. "His comfort is the only thing that has a price tag I'm willing to pay," I told her, my heart aching for the man who was currently the only anchor left in my world. Now the night wasn't over. A heavy pounding on my door signaled the arrival of the family's enforcer. Dante pushed his way inside, his face flushed with a dangerous, erratic energy. The success of Nylene's livestream had emboldened him. He loomed over me, trying to use his height as a weapon of intimidation. "Where is it, Midge?" he snarled, his eyes darting around the room. "We know you didn't sell it yet. That junk meant something to the old man, and you're just pathetic enough to keep it close." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, looking him directly in the eyes until he was the one to look away. "Strength isn't about who can shout the loudest, Dante," I said, my voice steady. "It's about who can stand the longest in the storm." My refusal to react to his threats made him more volatile, and his hands trembling as he tossed my books from the shelves. I watched him search, a strange pity washing over me. He was looking for an object, a piece of canvas to sell, while I was playing a game of chess involving the very destiny of our father. The Crawford family's greatest weakness had always been their assumption that I was as greedy and small-minded as they were. They couldn't conceive of a motive beyond the dollar. Dante finally left, cursing under his breath, leaving my sanctuary in shambles. I began to pick up the coins Nylene had thrown, placing them in a neat row on the table. It was a reminder that I was no longer playing by their rules. I was playing by the truth, and the truth was a debt they could never afford to pay. I sat back down in the dark, the adrenaline beginning to fade into a cold, sharp resolve. But my phone buzzed again. Not a notification, but a text from an unknown number. I opened the message, and the breath left my lungs in a sudden, violent gasp. It was a photo of my father's hospital room, taken from the doorway. The red light on his oxygen monitor was circled in a jagged, digital stroke. Below it, the text read, "Every breath he takes has a cost. Can you afford it, Midge?" I stared at the flickering red light in the photo, a cold shiver racing down my spine. The coins on the table suddenly felt like 30 pieces of silver. I realized my mother wasn't just playing for the painting anymore. She was playing for blood, and she had just turned my father's life support into her final bargaining chip. The war was no longer about a masterpiece. It was about the very air in my father's lungs. The rhythmic, a haunting beep hiss of the ventilator echoed through the sterile hospital corridor, a sound that had become the metronome of my nightmares. I stood perfectly still, my back pressed against the cold, white-tiled wall, clutching my phone until my fingernails bit into my palms. The photo on the screen was a jagged blade of reality, the oxygen monitor in my father's room, circled in a mocking, digital red. Every time I closed my eyes, the image burned into my retinas, a reminder that my family had finally traded their humanity for a price tag. Griselda appeared at the end of the hallway, her heels clicking with a predatory rhythm that set my teeth on edge. She didn't approach as a mother or even a concerned wife. She moved like a cold creditor coming to collect a debt. She stopped inches from me, and the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the sharp smell of antiseptic. "I've reevaluated the family's medical expenditures, Midge," she said, her voice devoid of even a hint of warmth. She held out a leather-bound folder. "I've signed the paperwork to move your father to a state-run facility. They offer minimal life support, but it's all the Crawford estate can afford. Unless, of course, that Vermeer is returned to where it belongs." I looked at her, searching for a shred of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories, but I found only a hollow void. "A person's soul isn't measured by their bank account, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt heavier than a scream. "It's measured by what they are willing to sacrifice for the ones they claim to love. But you aren't just killing him with this. You're killing the last shred of my respect for you." I refused to take the folder. I knew the legalities. As his medical proxy, I had 24 hours to dispute the transfer. I had to adjust my sails because I couldn't control the wind. Griselda remained a blurred, dark figure in my periphery as I turned my gaze back to the intensive care unit, my resolve hardening into iron. The pressure followed me home, a suffocating weight that made the Boston air feel thin. I turned the corner to my street and stopped. My apartment door stood wide open, the wood splintered around the lock. Inside, the shadows were alive with movement. Men in tactical gear, sporting FBI patches, were ransacking my sanctuary, throwing books from shelves and overturning furniture. And they shouted about seizing stolen government property, their voices gruff and rehearsed. I stayed in the doorway, my breathing shallow, my mind shifting into a cold, analytical gear. I watched the man leading the raid, his movements clumsy and frantic. My eyes dropped to his feet. He was wearing a pair of limited edition sneakers, the same neon-laced ones I had seen Dante wearing at the birthday party. I didn't feel fear. I felt a chilling sense of clarity. This wasn't a federal seizure. This was a desperate amateur heist orchestrated by my own brother, a phantom raid meant to terrorize me into submission. I pulled out my phone and began to film from the shadows of the hallway, capturing every shattered lamp and Dante's muffled, angry voice as he screamed at his thugs to find that damn trash painting. It was a pathetic display of greed. I felt a strange, hollow pity for him as I watched him tear through my sketches. He was willing to stage a felony heist against his own sister for a piece of canvas, never realizing that the Vermeer was miles away, safe in a climate-controlled vault. "It's sad, Dante," I whispered to the empty hallway. "You've traded your dignity for a frame." Greed had blinded the hunter to the trap I had set. I waited until they gathered what they thought was the prize, my heart steady despite the chaos. Dante finally emerged from the bedroom, letting out a triumphant, guttural howl as he clutched a canvas wrapped in mud-stained garbage bags. He and his team fled down the fire escape, leaving my life in ruins behind them. I walked into the wreckage of my home, the silence now louder than the raid had been. My eyes caught a glint of copper on the floor, the single coin Nylene had thrown at me days ago. I picked it up and placed it on my desk, a solitary monument to their cruelty. I immediately called Xavier and my attorney, the adrenaline now a sharp, focused hum in my veins. We discussed the footage, the breaking and entering, the impersonation of a federal officer. It was enough to bury Dante for a decade, but I chose to hold my fire. I knew exactly what he had stolen. A high-quality digital print I had prepared, and aged specifically for this scenario. The best way to win a war is to let your enemies celebrate a victory they haven't earned. I had to play for time, knowing that the next 12 hours would decide if my father breathed as a free man or a prisoner of Griselda's greed. And the quiet power of my plan was the only thing keeping me upright. I began to straighten a few fallen books, my thoughts already drifting back to the hospital. Just as I reached for my keys, my phone erupted with a frantic ringtone. It was the hospital. My heart spiked, a sudden, cold terror gripping my chest. I answered, my voice barely a breath. "Midge, come quickly," the nurse whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Your father's vitals are spiking across the board. He's fighting the sedation, Midge. He's trying to say something. I think he's finally waking up." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, the engine roaring to life as I sped back toward Beacon Hill. The city lights blurred into long, white streaks of hope against the dark Boston sky. Griselda was currently celebrating with a fake masterpiece, but I realized the real miracle was finally opening his eyes. The air in my lungs suddenly felt sweet again, because for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting alone. The drive to the Crawford mansion was a blur of neon city lights, and the cold realization that my father's life was being measured in volts and cubic centimeters of oxygen. I knew Griselda was attending a high society charity gala, a performance of virtue to mask her rotting bank accounts. This was my window. I let myself into the dark, echoing library, the air smelling of stagnant privilege and dust. I moved straight to the family safe, my fingers finding the key I had liberated from the Vermeer's frame. The mechanical clicks of the lock sounded like a gavel coming down, a heavy, metallic resonance of reclamation. As the heavy door swung open, I didn't find the stacks of cash I expected. Instead, I found the paper trail of a slow-motion murder. Tucked inside a leather-bound folder was my father's original will, dated before his accident, and a handwritten log of his medical regimen. My stomach twisted as I compared the entries. Griselda had been systematically substituting his life-saving heart medication with high-dose sedatives. She hadn't just been waiting for him to die. She had been keeping him incoherent, a living vegetable she could harvest for signatures. I didn't let the fury consume me. I took a deep breath, my hands steady as I photographed every document with my phone. I reached into my bag and pulled out the actual heart medication I had secured from a sympathetic pharmacist using an old prescription. I swapped the sedatives in the medicine cabinet for the real pills, effectively beginning his awakening from within the lion's den. I looked up at the oil portrait of the Crawford ancestors on the wall. "True wealth isn't what you take from the world, Mother," I whispered into the cold dark. "It's what you protect within it. I am not stealing from you. I am returning the truth to this house." The peace didn't last. By the next morning, Griselda had launched her counteroffensive. She didn't use a knife. She used the law. I arrived at the Massachusetts Probate and Family Court to find a swarm of reporters and a team of lawyers. Griselda had filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship, claiming I was mentally unstable. She presented Nylene's viral video as evidence of my erratic behavior and my obsessive delusion over a piece of garage sale junk. The air in the courtroom was sterile and oppressive, the judge peering over her glasses with a look of deep skepticism. I sat at the defense table, my back straight, my expression a mask of stoic calm. Griselda's lawyer spoke of my unhealthy fixation and my financial instability, painting me as a daughter who had lost her grip on reality. I felt the collective gaze of the gallery, the silent judgment of a world that loves to see a woman fall. I looked at Midge in the reflection of the mahogany table, a woman who had been erased, but who was now refusing to be silenced. Justice is like a garden. If you pull the weeds too early, you might miss the roots. I had waited long enough for the rot to show itself. When it was our turn, my attorney didn't argue about my feelings. He simply presented my International Art Restoration certification and a certified ironclad appraisal from Sotheby's. The room went dead silent as the projected image of the Vermeer appeared on the screen, its value listed at $500 million. Then, we played the video I had captured of the FBI raid. The sight of Dante in his neon sneakers, screaming at thugs while ransacking my home, destroyed the family's credibility in 90 seconds. The judge's face shifted from skepticism to cold, hard clarity. The tide didn't just turn, it became a tsunami. My attorney revealed the ultimate tactical maneuver. Over the last 48 hours, and I had used my anonymous LLC to buy up the defaulted mortgages and loans on the Crawford estate. I wasn't just the discarded daughter anymore. I was technically my mother's landlord and her primary creditor. Griselda's face went a sickly shade of gray, her hands trembling as she realized her junk had just bought her entire world. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the old weight of her disapproval. Despite having the legal power to evict her that very hour, I addressed the court with a calm that unsettled everyone. I agreed to let her remain in the house, provided she was placed under strict financial and medical supervision. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Mother," I said, my voice echoing in the hallowed hall. "It means refusing to let your bitterness change who I am. You chose to be a predator. I choose to be a daughter." It was a victory of character over greed, a quiet power that resonated louder than any shouting match. As the judge dismissed the hearing, My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Xavier at the hospital. My breath caught in my throat as I read the words. My father had just spoken his first coherent words in 2 years, and the first thing he asked was for me. The miracle wasn't just in the money or the painting. It was in the breath he was finally taking on his own terms. I felt a profound sense of relief, a warmth that started in my chest and spread to my very soul. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble with a newfound purpose. I didn't realize it then, but the hardest part of the war was already won. I had protected the one person who mattered, but as I reached the exit, I saw Griselda and Dante huddled in the shadows of the hallway. They weren't defeated, they were cornered, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. I caught the tail end of my mother's whisper, her eyes fixed on me with a hatred that was truly terrifying. If she wants a war of tea and sympathy, we'll give her something she can't survive. Invite her to the farewell dinner tomorrow. Make sure the vintage 1945 Bordeaux is ready. I watched them whispering, knowing the invitation they were about to send wasn't an olive branch, but a poisoned chalice. The rain-slicked cobblestones of Beacon Hill gleamed like obsidian under the amber glow of the street lamps as I stepped out of the car. The Crawford mansion loomed ahead, a fortress of old money and new sins, its windows flickering with the deceptive warmth of candlelight. Oh, I smoothed the fabric of my simple black dress, a stark contrast to the flamboyant, desperate elegance I knew awaited me inside. I wasn't walking into a dinner. I was walking into the mouth of a cornered beast. The atmosphere inside was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the sharp metallic tang of hidden malice. Griselda and Dante were already seated, their faces masks of artificial contrition that didn't quite reach their eyes. This was staged as a peace offering, a chance to put the past behind us, before the Vermeer went to auction. I watched Dante's hands. They trembled slightly as he uncorked a bottle of vintage 1945 Bordeaux, a wine far too precious for a casual Tuesday. I remained calm, my internal peace a shield they couldn't penetrate. I had already synced my smartwatch to the mansion's security feed, the silent digital heartbeat of the room now broadcasting to Xavier's secure server. Before taking my seat, I reached into my small clutch and pulled out a velvet box. I placed it gently in front of my mother. "I found this in the trash you gave me, Mother," I said, my voice steady and soft. "It's Grandma's locket. I restored it because I wanted you to have something beautiful to remember this night by." It was an act of grace, a reminder that I didn't come for blood, but for the truth. Griselda's eyes flickered with a brief, unreadable emotion, perhaps a ghost of regret, or perhaps just annoyance that I hadn't come armed with the hatred she expected. I sat down, the weight of the silence between us heavier than the silver on the table. The meal was a chore of shallow pleasantries, each word a step through a minefield. Griselda eventually raised her glass, her voice dripping with a saccharine warmth that made my skin crawl. "To new beginnings," she toasted, her gaze fixed on mine. "And to family, no matter how far we stray." I noticed the subtle geometry of the table. My glass had been pre-poured, sitting precisely in its spot, while Dante and Griselda had poured theirs in the open. They expected me to drink to my own destruction. A sudden violent thunderclap rattled the window panes, and in that split second of distraction, I executed the swap. It was a sleight of hand I had perfected over years of moving delicate garden seedlings, quick, silent, and absolute. I watched with a detached, analytical calm as Griselda took a deep, triumphant swallow of the Bordeaux. She thought she was drinking to my incapacitation, to a forced signature on a document that would strip me of the Vermeer once and for all. But the sedative she had intended for me was now coursing through her own veins. Within minutes, the facade of the Beacon Hill socialite began to crack. Her movements became heavy, her speech slurring as the high-dose sedative hit her system. She began to ramble, her eyes glazing over as she looked at me, believing I was the one slipping away. It was a heartbreaking sight, not a triumphant one, I looked at the woman who had raised me, now a slurry mess of greed and desperation, and felt a profound sadness. The most tragic prison isn't made of bars, but of the lies we tell ourselves to justify hurting our own flesh and blood. Griselda began to boast, a giddy, drug-induced confession pouring from her lips like bitter gall. She spoke of faking the FBI raid, of erasing my father's true intentions, and of the bitter joy she felt when she thought she had finally put me in my place. I didn't taunt her, and I simply bore witness to the rot she had allowed to consume her soul. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the hardwood, and tapped the face of my watch. Across the room, the large, ornate television flickered to life. It wasn't playing the news. It was a live, high-definition broadcast of this very dining room, a feed that was currently being watched by the elite of Beacon Hill and the local police precinct. Dante froze, his fork clattering against his china plate as he realized the game was over. He lunged for me, a desperate, clumsy move born of a lifetime of unearned privilege, but I sidestepped him with a grace that came from years of standing my ground. "You didn't lose because I was smarter, Dante," I said, looking him in the eye as the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the rain. "You lost because you never realized that family is a sanctuary, not a transaction." The logic of the situation was now ironclad. Under the laws of this Commonwealth, her recorded confession of intent to poison and the admission of financial fraud provided the authorities with everything they needed. I hadn't used a weapon. I had simply turned on the lights and let them see what they had become. Light doesn't just reveal beauty. It burns away the rot that thrives in the dark. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to pulse against the dining room walls, casting a surreal, strobe-like effect on the scene. I watched as the officers entered, their presence a final, cold period at the end of a very long sentence. My revenge was nothing more than the withdrawal of my presence from their lives. A total, a legal separation that left them with only their own choices for company. I felt a strange, quiet power in that moment. The power of a woman who no longer needed to hide her strength to make others feel comfortable. As Griselda was helped into a cruiser and Dante was led away in silence, my phone erupted with a frantic ringtone. It was Xavier. I answered, my heart skipping a beat as I heard the tension in his voice. "Midge, the auction house just called," he said, the words coming in a breathless rush. "There's a massive problem with the Vermeer's provenance claim. Someone just stepped forward with an older secret deed from the 70s, and they've filed an injunction to halt the sale. You're not going to believe who it is, Midge. We have to get to New York now." I stood amidst the flashing lights, as the taste of my victory turning to ash in my mouth. I had thought the battle was won, but I realized that the hardest fight for the truth was only just beginning. The Crawford legacy was deeper than I had imagined, and the secret my father had hidden was about to be pulled into a light I wasn't sure I was ready for. I looked at the dark house behind me one last time before turning toward the car, my mind already calculating the next move in a game that had just grown much, much larger. The engine of the car hummed a steady, low vibration as I left the dark shadows of Beacon Hill behind. Every mile toward New York City felt like a layer of old skin shedding. I was no longer the daughter waiting for permission to exist. I was the architect of my own liberation. The lights of the Manhattan skyline began to rise over the horizon, as sharp and clinical, a stark contrast to the stagnant, candlelit halls of my mother's house. I was driving toward the final movement of a symphony my father had started 30 years ago, a piece of music I was finally ready to conduct. 1 month later, I stood in a private viewing room at Sotheby's. The high-ceilinged, sterile elegance of the space felt like a sanctuary. On the easel before me sat Vermeer's The Concert. It had been cleaned, the centuries of grime replaced by a glow so ethereal it seemed to breathe. Xavier stood beside me, his usual professional detachment replaced by a look of profound awe. He handed me a folder of documents, the result of a deep-dive investigation into my father's secret history. The threat to the provenance wasn't a threat at all. It was a masterstroke of love. In the 1970s, long before Griselda's gambling debts had begun to hollow out our lives, my father had filed a silent deed of trust in a different state. He had legally named Midge, his youngest, his little seed, as the sole custodian of his private collections. It was a legal fortress he had built specifically to predate any claim my mother could ever make. He had known, even then, that his trust belonged in my hands. I ran my fingers along the edge of the folder, realizing I had been his silent partner all along. A true legacy isn't built on what you leave for people, but what you leave in them. He left his faith in me, and I had finally proven worthy of it. The auction hall was a sea of tailored wool and hushed, expectant whispers. I watched from the wings as Griselda and Dante entered, out on bail and flanked by a phalanx of lawyers. They moved like vultures in designer suits, their eyes scanning the room for the profit they still believed was theirs. They were relying on communal property laws to seize the proceeds, confident that my father's incoherence would leave them in control. The bidding war began at a staggering $100 million. The atmosphere became electric, the numbers climbing with a frantic, rhythmic intensity that felt like a heartbeat. 300 million, 400 million. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Finally, the hammer fell at $500 million. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent hall. Griselda stood up immediately, a triumphant, jagged smile on her face as she prepared to claim the spoils. But my legal team moved faster. We presented the sovereign recovery documents, a set of ironclad filings signed by my now coherent and legally reinstated father. The doors at the back of the hall opened, and the room went deathly silent. My father entered, leaning on a cane but walking with a dignity that silenced every lawyer in the room. He didn't look at the auctioneer or the bank of phones. He looked only at me. His presence alone was an absolute invalidation of every lie Griselda had told the probate court. The auctioneer, after a brief huddle with the legal observers, recognized my father and me as the sole legal recipients of the funds. I turned to my mother's shocked, ashen face, and I remembered then that the best way to handle an enemy is to refuse to become one. "You chase the price, Mother," I said, my voice a calm, steady anchor in the chaos. "I chase the truth. The price has a limit. The truth is boundless." The final threshold came an hour later in a private suite. I met Griselda and Dante one last time. I didn't have them arrested for the poisoning. The district attorney was already handling the fraud charges. I simply opened my checkbook and wrote a single check. I slid the $1 restitution across the table. "This is for the birthday gift you gave me," I said, the words falling like smooth stones into a deep well. "I am returning the value you placed on me. We are now even. From this moment on, you are no longer a part of my story. You are free to be exactly who you are. But you will do it away from us." I walked out of Sotheby's and into the brilliant New York sunshine, the warmth of the city afternoon feeling like a benediction. I didn't buy a yacht or a penthouse. I bought a quiet, accessible garden estate in the countryside, a place of rolling hills and ancient oaks where the air was always sweet. It was a space my father could call home, surrounded by the very nature I had spent my life restoring. I realized that the money hadn't changed me. It had simply removed the noise, allowing the person I already was to finally be heard. The final shot of my life isn't a bank balance or a crowded gala. It's a wide, serene view of a garden at sunset. My father is sitting on a bench, his hands resting on his cane, watching the goldfinches flit through the lavender. I am standing beside him, and the silence between us full and peaceful. I am Midge, and for the first time in 33 years, I am exactly where I belong. The camera pulls back, further and further, until we are just two small, quiet figures in a vast, beautiful landscape. Free, sovereign, and finally, home.